We have to ask, what happens when these exact structural mechanisms, coercion, identity capture, and loss of agency, are used to enslave the mind,
Huh.
specifically in the context of children and education?
This is where it gets very challenging.
This is the most provocative argument in our stack, and we need to approach it with extreme care and rigor. The source material claims that widespread, institutionalized, shame-based teaching practices
Specifically, those that assign collective, inherited blame to children.
can constitute a form of systemic emotional abuse, or, structurally speaking, enslavement through shame.
We have to pause right here because the terminology is designed to shock. The sources are absolutely adamant that this is a parallel of structural logic used to deny agency and dignity.
Not a moral equivalence.
Not a moral equivalence with the physical suffering, the violence, and the generational cruelty of chattel slavery. This comparison is purely functional. We are comparing the architecture of the cage, not the pain felt inside the cage.
That distinction is crucial, but I have to challenge it a bit. When you use the word enslavement, the listener immediately thinks of the historical reality, the chains, the auctions, the whip. How can any pedagogical practice, however poor or misguided, functionally share a blueprint with those immense historical evils without diminishing their memory?
It's a fair challenge, and I think the defense from the sources lies in that three-part blueprint we just defined. The source material focuses on the child's fundamental right to dignity, which is derived from the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Okay.
And their argument is if an institutional practice consistently and systematically denies a child agency and individual identity through coercion, it is utilizing the same structural logic used by historical exploiters. Even if the tools are psychological rather than physical, we are analyzing the mechanism of control, not the quantum of suffering.
Understood. So let's
Yeah.
identify the specific harmful practices the sources criticize,
Yeah.
the ones that trigger the structural comparison. We're talking about curriculum and classroom management that shifts from teaching history and moral reasoning to personal moral indictment of the child in the room.
Exactly. The practices cited include things like compelled public confessions or highly publicized privileged check-ins, which force children into performative compliance.
Okay.
Labeling children as oppressor or inheritor of guilt based purely on their ancestral or group identity, and constructing a system where a child's intrinsic worth or moral standing is measured by how willing they are to accept an externally assigned negative group status.
The sources argue the line is crossed when historical learning shifts from preventing future injustice to moral indictment of the present non-agentic child.
That is the line.
Okay, let's apply our three-part blueprint to the classroom context then, to show those structural parallels side by side.
Let's do it, starting with coercion. In historical and modern labor systems, it was physical violence or financial threat.
Right.
In this psychological system, it shifts to psychological coercion, the profound, institutionally reinforced fear of social exclusion.
Which, for a child, is immense.
It's one of the most potent forms of social threat. This includes the use of guilt activities, public shaming, and the immediate silencing of any reflective dissent or questioning of the assigned narrative. The threat of social isolation replaces the physical chain.
Next, identity capture. Where historical systems reduce the individual to property or disposable labor, this pedagogy reduces the child's complex, evolving individual identity to what?
To a rigid, inherited group label.
So the child's unique merits, their choices, their personal journey, all of that gets collapsed.
All collapse into a single moral failing or immutable status, descendant of perpetrator or privileged. They are denied the right to be seen as an individual acting in the present,
They're defined by the actions of people who came before them.
which is structurally analogous to partus sequitur ventrum. The child's fate is determined by the group status they inherited, not by their individual actions or character.
And this profound reduction of personhood leads directly to the third mechanism, loss of agency.
Students are denied agency through silencing and the demand for compliant performance. If a child questions the narrative or refuses the compelled confession, their voice is often dismissed.
Not engaged with.
Not engaged with. It's labeled as fragility, resistance, or even as evidence of their innate moral failing. The sources argue this replaces genuine reflective learning with fear-driven performative compliance.
So the child learns to say what is expected, not what they actually think or feel.
And that denial of voice and intellectual autonomy is the loss of agency.
The study's focus on children here is paramount, isn't it? The vulnerability of children who are in these crucial stages of identity formation means that institutionalized psychological coercion can be particularly damaging.
Devastatingly so.
So who are the victims of this shame pedagogy, according to the sources?
The sources are very specific here. This practice harms children on all sides of the equation. Children perceived as descendants of beneficiaries, often white children in Western contexts, are at grave risk of internalizing debilitating guilt, shame, anxiety, and deep identity confusion. They are being morally indicted for things they did not do.
Which can lead to self-hatred and disengagement.
Exactly. But conversely, we have to emphasize the harm done to children perceived as descendants of victims.
Right, because they also suffer a structural denial of agency.
They do. They risk stigmatization and being reduced to a state of perpetual victimhood. While recognition of historical injustice is vital, reducing their identity solely to historical trauma denies their present resilience, their capacity for agency, and their self-determination.
So both forms of identity capture deny the full, complex, and agentic personhood of the child.
Yes.
This brings us to the international mandate, the ethical firewall that the sources rely upon.
The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CRC.
How does international law explicitly provide an antidote to this idea of inherited guilt?
International law is crystal clear on this. The CRC explicitly rejects inherited guilt. Article 29 is the key here. It mandates that education must be directed toward the full development of the child's personality.
Okay.
It has to foster empathy and build moral responsibility in the individual. Crucially, it mandates that education must protect the child's dignity above all else.
So the line is crossed when the goal shifts from historical truth and preventing future injustice teaching about the architecture of exploitation to the moral indictment of the present child based on their ancestral group status.
That is the line. The goal of a healthy system is to give the child agency and moral responsibility for today's actions and choices. A system that structurally denies agency by imposing inherited shame is fundamentally violating the child's dignity.